I have somehow managed to make it these 31 years without ever having once touched a piece by Hector Berlioz. And more the shame for me, because I am never disappointed when a composer sets the poetry of Théophile Gautier, and this piece is no exception. In a few days, I'll be singing Berlioz's Nuits D'Éte, a song cycle I'd only ever heard of abstractly in my French vocal literature course at conservatory, so today I'm preparing the second song in the cycle, Le Spectre de la Rose. The score preparation techniques I'll be using today are my go-to method, and let me be the second to tell you, the first being the title of this video, Gautier's poetry is absolutely to die for. But however one prefers to luxuriate in linguistic loveliness, this is also a particularly pleasing piece in both its musical peculiarities and its interpretive ambiguity. When I began this project, I was fully ready to prepare my score through my usual environmentally friendly, if historically inaccurate, iPad score editing method, but unfortunately my 10-year-old iPad met a sudden, violent, undignified end at the hands of my clumsiness, and I was forced to resort to those bygone methods of paper and ink. Anytime I'm picking up a new piece, I always start with the poetry, since that's almost always what the composer would have started with as well. So I started by writing out the poem in its original French, just to get a feel for the overall flow of the text. And while I did take many French classes over the course of my education, I am still by no means fluent, and so I left some room here between the words for my translations later. Yes, translations in the plural, more on that in a moment. I've changed translation techniques over the years to experiment with newfangled technology as it comes around, but I have yet to find a better method for my ultimate performances than internalizing the text by breaking the words down to their very grammatical foundation. So I always start with a word-for-word translation. Those of you who have studied a foreign language may understandably question the futility of this because, and you're very right, it won't make sense at first. But I find that this actually directs me to really consider each word, why the poet chose this synonym over that one, where the rhyming scheme helped or hindered the grammar, the rhythm of the sounds, and other sundry nerdy poetic analysis. With my word-for-word translation finished, I took a bit of freedom in creating my own poetic translation. It's not a direct translation in the strictest sense of the word because I won't be performing this in English. So the purpose isn't to capture the truest version of the French. Instead, I wanted it to help me connect to the poetry emotionally in the same way that a native French speaker might. So since this translation will not be shared for any sort of academic purpose, I wasn't overly fussy about honoring every single nuance of the original text. It's the response one feels in one's mind as the performer that ultimately matters. And this is why I always start with my own translation, because when I'm translating, I inevitably stumble across words or phrases that I cannot, with either a dictionary or a computer, translate. Like this phrase here, sans que tu puisses le chasser, which I guess means that you can't chase away. But I'm not sure, and if I just went straight in with a translation that was done by someone else, I would miss this gap in my French knowledge. Was there a reason that the poem was written this way? We shall see, but in the meantime, I will need to consult the master. I finished up the rest of the poem, and then, by comparing my own translation to Mr. Graham Johnson's, I could see a few other areas where I made mistakes, so I quickly corrected those. There were also more than a few of his phrases that were far more beautiful than anything I'd come up with on my own, so I shamelessly pilfered them for my own purposes. And it's at this point that we should just take a moment to appreciate some of this writing. Lines like, You plucked me, still pearled with the silver tears of the watering can. Or like, this delicate perfume is my soul. I don't know what to say except I worship at the altar of excessively flowery poetry. My translations are complete. I have my word-for-word text that helped me to create my poetic translation down at the bottom in the pencil, and now it's all ready to be transferred properly to my music. As I transferred my personal poetic translation into my score, I made sure to leave room for the IPA I'd be adding afterwards. The translation is just here so I can make more informed musical decisions without having to, always pull out my word-for-word translation. So I kept these lines at the bottom of the staff away from my French text and then stored the poetry away for a future Cait. With my translation done, it was time to focus on the French itself. While I'm mostly familiar with the pronunciation rules after years of diction teachers and coaches wielding their metaphorical rulers over my hands, I still prefer to use a professionally prepared IPA chart for pieces I'll be performing for an audience, particularly when it comes to French. Those pesky liaisons and possibly pronounced double L's catch me off guard every single time. So, with IPA in hand, I started speaking the poetry aloud, not yet in rhythm, to hear where I stumbled over pronunciation. Then, I only wrote those stumbling blocks into my score for reference while I'm singing, since singing from a score of 100% IPA is an absolute no-go for me. Alright, mesdames et messieurs, it is time to start looking at the music. As you can see, I have chosen to go with Berlioz's original piano setting rather than the orchestral one, so I'm going to focus first on my part, it's the orchestral one there, on my part in isolation, and then I'm going to figure out how it fits into the overall texture of the piece. And I know that we just did all this language and poetry prep, which I will come back to momentarily, but the most important thing at the moment is very simply to master the notes and the rhythms before I start applying the French over the top of that. Tuning and rhythm above all. As with all pieces I'm tackling for the first time, I treated the learning process as an exercise in sight reading. It's a skill one could train for one's entire life and still improve every day, of course, but I still feel that my sight reading is not at a standard that I'm happy with yet, so any opportunity I can create for myself to get some practice in, particularly with pieces as slow and tonal as this one, are opportunities I take advantage of. Oh, it's a fourth. Once I had the notes and rhythms, I sang through the melody as a whole just a couple of times and without the words just yet. Keeping that text away from the music while I'm learning it lets me isolate those tricky technique areas, since vocalises do tend to be much more friendly than songs when it comes to navigating a challenging passage. That's an E. So as I do-do-do'd, I made a note of the areas that I thought might get more complicated with a funny vowel or a consonant cluster once I actually started adding text back in. With the tune and the rhythms now well in hand, I finally started applying my text. The trick here is to apply musicality immediately. You plucked me. Oh, you plucked me. The poetry informed both the melody and the rhythm that Berlioz ultimately chose, and I can just picture him sitting at his composition desk, like muttering the words aloud and conducting to himself as he imagined a melody. So I wanted to try to honor that feeling of creation as much as possible, so I chose my interpreting moments as I added the text in, using Berlioz's phrasing to help inform the decisions when I was debating my options. If we look at this line, for instance, more than one would have given his life for on your breast I have my tomb. I'm considering a couple of different interpretations. Is it more than one, or more than one would have given his life, or maybe even more than one would have given his life? But when I see what Berlioz wrote here melodically, It's pretty clear he wants the emphasis on one, doo-doo, and on life, doo-doo, just based on their rhythmic length and their melodic height relative to the rest of the line. So I'll go with that here. But then sometimes I like to subvert what the composer likely intended, just to like play with the meaning a little bit. That's a common technique for strophic pieces, of course, which this one is not, but I also love it in moments like this. See, Berlioz is pretty ambiguous in this next line about where we could put the stress. I have my tomb. I think most of us would expect the emphasis to fall on tomb here, on tombeau, since it's both the musical resolution of the phrase and also the direct object of the text. But in playing with some other stresses, I'm finding I actually prefer to put the stress on the possessive of my. I have my tomb. I find that so much more interesting, both musically and poetically. And I do hope that Monsieur Berlioz agrees from his, celestial podium, because it's going in my score. At this point, I had my poem, my notes and rhythms, and my interpretation all squared away. I still needed to fit those elements into my technique, but first, I had to find my place in the piano's texture. Just because a piece is written for a soloist doesn't mean the entire piece is a solo, especially in the Romantic era. So I went through my score taking note of two things. First, the piano accompaniment, here in heavy quotes. When does it have melody moments? When is it a duet partner, etc.? And then second, never to be underestimated, the dynamics. Oftentimes, dynamic markings will be heavily notated in one instrument, but not in another. And honoring dynamics is important for expression, of course, but also, more practically, for knowing when a wayward fortissimo bass chord might drown out my otherwise exquisitely sensitive pianissimo. So I scanned the piano's lines for any extra dynamic markings and then transferred those to my own vocal line as needed. With all the elements now in place, I, of course, needed to sing through the piece a few times to make sure I was happy with everything I had added. And it's inevitable that one will find places of change once the parts become a cohesive whole, so flexibility was the most important part of the process at this point. I also have to be gentle with myself, as I'm still not quite comfortable with my new technique after hemorrhaging one of my vocal cords a few years ago. I find it's often frustrating to not be physically capable of the musical decisions I want to make at certain points. But patience and forgiveness are all one can ask from oneself. And, after all, perfection should not be the only reason that we enjoy music. Sometimes I think I should tattoo that on my face so I can read it in the mirror 18 times a day. And finally, let's add the piano. Thank you so much for watching. If this was of interest to you, then you might also be interested in this video here, where I tackle some less operatic but nonetheless historical style singing. Otherwise, I hope you have a very pleasant rest of your day or evening, and I will see you next time on Scores Unstitched.